if you're not going to change your clinical behavior as a result of your case conceptualization, then there's no reason to do a case conceptualization. If you're going to do
Mm,
the same version
it's
of
very
ACT
true.
or
Yep.
FAP or anything, if it doesn't change your behavior, then there's no sense putting the client through a pseudo assessment. You look professional here. You know what you're doing. I can tell. These are all things for production, proper
Yeah, it
post-production
is.
stuff.
Super professional. All right. On that note, welcome back to Act Root to Fruit. My name is Marcel Tassara, and I'm a psychologist, non congenital, trying to be behaviorist, working to dig into the roots of the contextual behavioral sciences. And I've got some just amazing guides along the way. I'm so grateful today to be joined by Dr. Bill Follette from University of Reno. Thanks, Bill, for joining me today.
Well, thanks. Glad to be here. It's
Yeah.
University of Nevada at
Did I
Reno.
at Reno? What did I say? University of Reno?
Yeah,
Yeah. Well, in the ACT world, you guys are big enough. There's no other
exactly.
university in Nevada. Right.
Exactly. That's what we tell UNLV all the time.
And I bet there used to be a La before your name at some point.
I think there probably was. I think there's an obscure way to get back to Robert La Follette. It was a Wisconsin senator long ago.
Oh yeah, yeah. Speaking of which, Bob Kohlenberg's from Milwaukee. To
Yes,
anybody,
he is.
he
He
is.
is.
My partner, who is from Columbia, thinks that I believe that everything is from Milwaukee. Because how often I reference things from this place. So, anyways, so yeah, thanks for joining me, Bill. Bill has been in this world of clinical behavioral analysis and outcome research for a really long time, and like I mentioned when I interviewed Glenn, who you've been in the room where a lot of this stuff has come out of. So
Yes. Yes,
so
indeed. I think I was in the room doing co-therapy with Bob Kohlenberg at one of the inspirational moments for functional analytic psychotherapy many years ago.
well, yeah, yeah, and you and Glenn are doing some really interesting work, which Glenn has agreed to come back and talk more about once I get further along the line in the interpersonal behavioral therapy work. So I'm excited
Yes.
to get into that. But now I'm kind of more in the molecules. So in terms of being precise, where you see is a integral part for people to have a grasp of in terms of this functional language. I know
Right. I
you're
think
yeah.
that's a really great question. And it's one that I think I get a little bit more focused on than lots of people do. So, you spoke about, Glenn Callahan and I. Glenn was a student of mine, got his PhD with me years ago, and just one of my very favorite human beings in the entire universe. I love the guy,
Yeah.
and we have a
He's
great
pretty
time.
lovable.
He is, um, but I think one of the things that we've paid attention to a lot in recent years is I think the lack of attention to the theoretical underpinnings of what we do in some of the third wave therapies, which would include FAP and ACT,
Mhm.
and it was sufficiently troublesome to us that we recently wrote this article on an alternative way of thinking about things in the called it interpersonal behavior therapy that appeared earlier in the year.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot that's distinctively different from what we call IBT from I think the underlying philosophy of what was in the 1991 functional analytic psychotherapy book that Bob and Maeve Asai wrote, which I
Mhm.
think is a great book, but not a great how to do therapy book. But it had lots of principles in it,
Okay.
and the underlying ideas are in that I think have gotten to be underappreciated in importance as dissemination ramped up for functional analytic psychotherapy.
Mhm.
I'll just call FAP from now on.
Yeah.
And I think the same thing happened in ACT to a degree, where if you go to ACBS, for example, and listen to lots of talks, it's very hard to see where principles are being tested so much as where techniques are being demonstrated.
Hmm.
And it's just my personal interest that I'm more interested in the link between what we do in therapy from a scientific explanatory process to the outcome than how it is we think about therapy as some kind of art that's um, that's totally peculiar to the practitioner.
Hmm.
Um, and I understand the problem with disseminating therapy to people who might be just less fascinated with the science part of things and devoted to caring and helping people. I mean, I don't have any objection to that.
Hmm.
It's just that I think it drifts to a different place than its roots started with.
Okay. In the aspiration of just drawing people in. Let's get them in the door potentially, and then they'll figure it out.
You know, I don't feel like I know exactly what the process is that happens there, except that if you look at the behavior of people who disseminate therapies, for example, their behavior is just human behavior. It's like anybody else's. I don't ascribe an amazing motive to them. I think their
Okay.
behavior gets shaped by what gets the attention for them when they give talks.
I see. Yeah.
Um, and it's it seems to be more interesting to people to hear clinical anecdotes or go through some set of um, exercises, which drive me crazy, by the way, at these kinds of things.
Yeah.
Um, and with little link between why we're doing this exercise to walk around the room and imagine people imagining you naked or whatever, um, and how that's tied to the scientific principles underneath it gets more and more diminished in a way that I think people learn techniques more than
Hmm.
principles, and I
Hmm.
think that makes people pay more attention to topography versus function, which I can talk about if that's not too
Yeah.
boring at some point in time.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. On that note, this semester I had some of my therapy. I had my therapy class. We started out with some philosophy of science papers and Linda Hayes papers, and boy, if looks could kill, I'd be. So
Yeah,
yeah, I get it. Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
you learn to see that glassy-eyed look of graduate students who say, "What is this all about?" And it's a problem in the following way. I got interested in what turns out to be best probably described as clinical behavior analysis from taking class from Bob Kohlenberg years and years and years ago when he was a fresh PhD out of UCLA and was extremely behavior analytically oriented. And it was the science that got my attention more than what the science was applied to. And Ivar Lovaas was doing his work with autistic children at the time.
Hmm.
We watched some of those early films, which you should watch on YouTube now if you want to see the power of the analysis and how
Oh yeah,
creative people
definitely.
can be.
I'll put some links in our chat notes.
Um, and it just captured my attention, and so I've always been interested in the application of the science more than anything else because it leads to good outcomes. And I was willing to pay that overhead to learn the science, but that there's a selection bias in there that may select for a different set of interests
Hmm.
than people who go in through a different route, who learn to want to be helpful from a slightly different mindset. And I don't have any thoughts about which is better. They just have different outcomes, I think. I would pick a path that emphasizes science kind of all the way through things, and someone who has a different initiation into the field would pick a path that emphasizes other
Yeah.
things. And
Yeah. Well, and I just want to be forthright with where I am at is I'm kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum in my initiation, and then I saw the limitations in that in terms of how I was functioning as a clinician, and that's brought me back to this path that I'm on now, which is trying to metabolize as much of the science as possible.
I think that's fabulous.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned clinical behavior analysis, and I did too. I'm wondering, like, and I kind of feel like right now in the CBS world that it's a hot term. You know, Emily's doing a lot of wonderful things in this area. How do you see how do you see clinical behavior analysis versus FAP versus IBT? If and you can answer a different question if you're hearing one that's better than the one I'm asking right now.
I always do that. People ask me questions, and I just pick the one I can answer. Um, so, you know, I think uh, I think clinical behavior analysis, and I think the difference between FAP and IBT, for example, really has to do with how you approach um, the problem. So, clinical behavior analysis is simply the application of behavior analytic principles to an, a neurotypical adult
Okay.
or child, for that
Mhm.
matter. I mean, in in clinical behavior in behavior analysis, sorry, applied in lots of clinical situations where there's a developmental disability or something like autism. In those settings, you have much higher control over the environmental contingencies because people aren't in free feeding environments. I mean, if you've got an autistic child in the Lovaas era where they were looking at severe autism and they didn't do the timing of the intervention quite right, um, initially anyway, these people are basically under institutional control. I mean, that's where they were many hours of the day. And so you had environmental controls and you were dealing with really fairly gross problems. By gross, I just mean large and
Mhm.
palpable.
Mhm.
You don't have to think about what functional class is banging your head against the wall. It is what it is.
Yeah.
And just the topography itself is enough to get attention and seem like a reasonable target. As you get less control over people's environment, say in a psychotherapy kind of setting, you're dealing with a different set of controlling variables for change.
Mhm.
You don't have as much access to what goes on outside the therapy room. But from my point of view, you still try to do the same sort of functional analysis, although clearly with less precision because you're looking at either self-reports of what's going on, which is inherently unsatisfactory, or you learn to look closely at what's going on between you and a client, which is where FAP, I think, is fascinatingly powerful in terms of having sources of information that you can do a case conceptualization on, at least in one that gives you an idea of where to look for sources of influence for the problem that gives rise to and maintains behavior that doesn't work for the client, and watching what goes on between you and the client that brings about different behavior on their part. If
Mhm.
you can analyze that technically as opposed to with less precise language, I think you can do interesting and powerful work. So I have no idea what question I just answer, if any at all.
A better one than I ask, that's for sure. Where I'm really trying to get, and I'll just ask that question, is around this idea of terminology in mid-level terms,
Oh,
and
yes.
how looking at the importance of process, and how that leads us to some concerns that someone like you might have around mid-level terms.
Yeah. So middle level terms are just a complicated set of issues. When we come up with a therapy, those of us who, either study them or try to improve them or understand what's going on, we're looking at pretty basic scientific processes. Um, so I'll stick with FAP mostly, I guess. We're PhDs and we're turning out PhDs, and even PsyDs, we're turning them out, I think, with an obligation to know some basic science behind what they do. If we think what we do is art, then I don't see the reason to get a PhD particularly. If I Because we're not going to turn out identical artists. I mean, you can get a PhD in art, I guess. I don't know why I say that, but I think what we do is based on principles that we should know about, and uh, and that is the overhead that maybe makes people's eyes glass over and not enjoy it a tremendous amount. But when you get into a really complicated clinical situation, making sense out of that is much easier when you have a case conceptualization that's built on scientific principles. And if you give those away and you use other explanatory mechanisms that are much removed from them, I think you lose precision, and I think you lose the ability to make um, on the spot, and that doesn't mean like instantly, but where you are in therapy, the ability to say what I'm doing isn't working for a particular set of reasons that if I step back from and look at in some detail, I might be able to identify and build a different strategy. And it could be at the level of what it is I'm targeting in therapy isn't even the right thing. It may look like it,
Hmm.
but it isn't the right thing, or the way I'm behaving isn't manipulating the kinds of environmental contingencies that I think would matter.
Yeah.
And so I've used the term topography enough times already. I just want to make sure that everybody's on board with that.
Hmm.
Topography is just what a behavior looks like. It's just kind of the physical characteristics of it. And that's very different from function. That is, what is the what is the behavior doing in the world at the moment?
Hmm.
And I have kind of a silly set of slides that I show when I'm talking about case conceptualization or assessment, where a, a a client comes in and talks to the therapist, and they say lots of things to the therapist, some of which, why you're really great, and I really like that you don't make me talk about things just for the purpose of crying. And then another one where they come in and say, um, I'm I'm I've just taken a bottle of pills and had a drink of vodka before I came in. Do you think that's something we should talk about? I mean, and it just goes on. And essentially, it's like a half a dozen different, highly variable presentations of what the client is doing.
Hmm.
Um, and in the end, it's obvious to a mythical supervisor that's in this scenario that what's going on is the client has a lot of different strategies to keep the therapist from pushing to talk about emotional distress. And they range from being late to session, to being suicidal, to
Hmm.
complimenting the therapist, to crying for an hour. And if you pay attention to all those topographies, which would be very difficult not to if you're sitting in the room in those situations as a therapist, but if you step back and see those are all functioning to keep from doing the behavior that they need to be doing in order to move on, that's an incredibly important thing to be able to detect. And if you think functionally about what's going on, I think it's easier to see than if you think procedurally about what's going on. Like, what should I be doing in this session? What
Hmm.
kind of techniquey thing should I be doing? So middle level terms, I think, take you away from that in ways that I think are not good for the client, and I think they're not good for the science. And I think about this as a science that needs to progress.
Okay.
So,
And
so
what's your definition of a mid-level term?
middle level term is one that is essentially made to, I think, communicate an idea to an audience in the process of dissemination that should have some properties of making a link between an underlying process and a behavior that you would see in the real world
Okay.
on the therapist side.
No.
But the difficulty is that those things will ha- have a life of their own. So when Steve Hayes developed his middle level terms on the hexaflex and so forth, he did some nice things initially, like having words that didn't have a natural meaning in to the verbal community. So diffusion, like, isn't a real word. So it's just there. It lives and dies within the context of act. But whether you have a real word that has its own history or a made up word that doesn't have its own history, it will develop a history.
Yeah.
And so how people respond to that the first time it appears is going to be much different than if you go to an ACT workshop now and you hear those words. There is a huge history around them, a very powerful history in the setting in which you would learn those kinds of things.
Okay.
So middle level terms just they they I think push us towards topography and lose function. And when I in FAP, the awareness, courage, and love have become middle level terms,
Hmm.
and for me, those are particularly unfortunate terms, primarily because the I don't think the terms to which they refer are very hard to learn in the first place. So ACT, if you go through relational frame theory, is complicated, and and the research paradigms are complicated to make sense out of, for good reasons. I mean, if you look at the work that Dermot Barnes Holmes and um, the relational frame theory guys do, it's it's meticulous in many ways, but it's not light reading at the end of the day. And
Hmm.
so I understand the overhead of getting into relational frame theory. But if you read some of the stuff that Yvonne Barnes Holmes talks about in her criticisms of, there's the dogs talking,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, that that Yvonne Barnes Holmes is critical about middle level terms. It's an important concern, and even that article is not light reading. But if you think about things like discrimination and uh, as recognizing a situation in which a behavior will experience consequences, that's, the discriminative stimulus, the behavior, the consequence in operant terms. Those aren't complicated things to think about. They don't need to be translated, I don't think, into a language that has an additional set of meanings into the verbal community, so that um, I think awareness discrimination is pretty straightforward, I think. I'm okay with that one. But courage and love have different connotations that come into the explanatory realm with their own meaning that you can't unbundle.
Yeah.
Love, for example, I think is not a neutral word. It's not like diffusion that came in with no history particularly. Love comes in with a huge history for both the therapist and the client and the
Mhm.
people in each of their verbal communities. So that I worry about those things not being A, accurate representations of what it means to supply contingencies,
Mhm.
and B, that it doesn't bring in a whole bunch of complicating stimulus properties when I say I'm acting in a loving way towards a client. Or to even say, and I've seen the examples in writing of this, um, the therapist saying to the client who feels unlovable, I love you.
Mhm.
It's just not hard to see, for me anyway, about what rabbit hole I can take people down. And I know many of the people in the FAP community, I love them. I mean, Bob Kohlenberg is just like one of the most important, influential people in my entire life.
Mhm.
And I would give him a kidney, and whatever. Um, but I, and others that I think have great hearts, and but I think the movement has moved towards a different place where some of the foundational principles just are in a not where I think the original ones are, and everybody has the right to kind of take things where they want to go. I think if you read the 2010 FAP book, the green FAP movement and the things Mavis was talking about in the end of that book are absolutely fab are absolutely fabulous kinds of um, things to which one would want to work. But those are different kinds of things than the idiographic goals that people come in with therapy. And I think that movement's great. It's just a different place,
Yeah.
but certainly
Yeah.
from a great heart.
Yeah. And you're proponent of this ideographic approach to understanding function.
Yep.
And um, how do you how do you start to get people thinking in those ways when you're working with students and
Well, I think you have to teach people. Well, let me just qualify this. Say I don't know perfectly how to do that because I think some of it comes in with people either have a history of trying to ask the question of why something is happening
Mhm.
from an appreciation of there are reasons, identifiable reasons why we behave that are functioning in the here and now. They're not just all immutable historical kinds of features. I mean, certainly by the time you see people in therapy, there is an enormous history that shaped this behavior, right? I mean, we think people behave for reasons. When Marsha Linehan talks about validation, kind of the important one that I pay attention to as opposed to some I don't, is you don't blame clients for behaving like they behave because we foundationally believe in a deterministic view of behavior. We could go off in a long quibble about how much behavior feels determined and what's cultural and what's real. It's a different issue. Happy to have that discussion, but it's a different issue.
Mhm.
But if you think people are behaving for reasons, then you try to figure out what those reasons are in the here and now, because I'm trying to teach people to do a case conceptualization that focuses on the things that uh, Steve Haynes and Bill O'Brien talk about in their books on functional assessment, functional analysis. You look at things that are in the here and now that are important, meaning if you change those variables, you can affect a substantial amount of behavior change in the client. Causal, that is, if I'm trying to change one variable that I can manipulate, it will actually change a behavior that matters to the client,
Mhm.
not strict causality, but I don't care if I'm moving a third variable. If that produces a change, I don't care. That's still fine. And then changeable, and changeable means there's stuff in the here and now that I can alter. Doesn't mean that things in the past don't matter. It's just in understanding the client's narrative of how they are, where they are, is important to establish rapport and understand how they use words so that you're paying attention to the stimulus conditions that give rise to those words. But changeable means that there's stuff that you try to identify now that's a remnant, perhaps of a historical thing, or that it's going on currently
Hmm.
that you can alter. And if you can't alter it, you can appreciate its historical value to the client and understanding their place in the world, but it doesn't matter in therapy. And I know that'll be misunderstood, and you can call me back on another day and I'll try to clarify it again, but it doesn't mean I don't
Why will
care
that be
about.
misunderstood?
Well, it will sound like I'm saying that people's history don't matter, and
Mhm. Mm.
or it doesn't matter, and
Mhm.
I don't mean that.
Yeah.
What I mean is trying to make people make sense out of their history as if that's the thing that's crucial is not as important to me as making sense out of how that history affects them right in the moment
Mhm.
and what
Mhm.
they're doing in response to stimulus conditions that
Yeah.
makes things go more usefully or less usefully for them.
Yeah. How is that different than psychoanalysis?
Well, I don't know enough about psychoanalysis to
Okay, let
possibly.
me ask this then. How is that different than me talking about someone's childhood with them, trying to help them figure out, you know, why they are like they are?
Well, because I'm not. It depends on what the figure out why means to you.
Okay.
Because if you're trying to do it to just for the purposes of understanding how I am where I am at the moment,
Mhm.
doesn't tell me how to move to someplace different. And,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
I'm interested in the moving to someplace different because that's why the client walks in the door. If they want to come in and do, 3 hours a week of you know kind of European understanding their life in the moment, but not having a goal of changing that. I can buy a boat and depend on weekly payments. That's a good thing,
Mhm.
but understanding isn't the goal that lots of clients have when that I see or supervise. It's wanting to be in a different place. So the why they are where they are is maybe a necessary first step to get people. I'm not saying it is, but it may be an important first step for some people to get to the position that they want to know how do they, given where they are now, how do they get to a different place?
Mm.
And certainly, one of the things that one worries about when you do just a historical kind of explanation for why people are now. Explaining behavior is often a clinical problem. If if I say do something different, which is not how I would ever
Mhm.
construct the
Mhm.
statement, and they say I can't because I was ignored by my nanny or whatever,
Mhm.
or many more realistic and terrible things. That explanation in and of itself will have a function, and the function can either be sort of a motivating operation to change if you create it correctly or help
Mhm.
structure it correctly, or it can just be a reason why they don't change. I can't do this because
Mhm.
I was abused as a child, or I was ignored, or I had an adverse childhood event. All those things are not unimportant to people getting to where they are now, but that exists in a long history of environmental contingencies. And the question is, if they want to move someplace different, what's going on in the here and now that's or isn't going on that needs to be going on to make it an environment where people are open to looking at contingencies to change
Mhm.
towards something that they value.
Okay. Yeah, as
So
you said.
yeah, I mean, understanding and change are not the same goals. So if you just want to say why I am like I am is a different question than given how I am, how do I be different?
Mhm.
And the information that you as a therapist need to answer those two questions aren't the same.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know where that leaves me right now as I'm thinking about this kind of, mouthful that you just said. And my question about kind of starting to see the function of behavior rather than just the topography, so that steers how I interact with a client.
Yeah, I've seen supervised a bunch of uh, grad students over the years, and they run across. I'm not a big diagnostic guy at all. In fact, I've written a bunch of articles that say it sucks. Um, but if you've seen someone who, in the vernacular, has a personality disorder, say, the clients that Marsha Linehan has
Mhm.
done work with, um, and
I
you,
think that's called presidential now.
that's, yeah, yeah. Don't get me started. Please, Marcel, don't get me started. Your podcast will be off the air in a heartbeat. Um, the the amount of apparent chaos when you see clients who are borderline, by just using the term sloppily here, and I don't mean it pejoratively,
Mhm.
but they they exhibit a very broad spectrum of behavior that gets called dysregulated and other kinds of things. And I just see young therapists get overwhelmed by the amount of affect that's in the room and the amount of content that's different from minute to minute about why things shouldn't be like they are is overwhelming. And if I can get therapists to see the function of what's going on in the room, it makes the forest and trees problem answerable. Things start to look. You don't just see a bunch of individual trees. You see clusters of trees that all look alike, act alike, bloom at the same time, go away at the same time. And it's usually not a monolithic thing that's going on in therapy, but it's not a thousand different behaviors, all of which are distressing to the client. More importantly to the therapist, from my point of view, because that's who I'm supervising. Um, there are a few things that are going on, and they're important things. And maybe uh, it's a lot of avoidance behavior or escape behavior. Not everything is that, but that's certainly one set of controlling contingencies
Mhm.
that explain lots of clinical behavior. And certainly, emotional avoidance in the ACT world is a huge way of conceptualizing things.
Yes.
And that conceptualization, if that's useful in understanding why behavior is occurring in the room as it is and what you can do to supply an environment where escape isn't reinforcing but kind of staying with something is reinforcing, then that's kind of that idiographic analysis. I mean,
Mhm.
escape is a more nomothetic kind of notion, but how it appears in a particular case is much more idiographic
Mhm.
and gives you, I think, a lot more flexibility to say, I have this hypothesis that when the client does this, it's because something has happened in the room that's aversive to them. It's not that this is autonomous behavior, but it's
Mm.
under the control of what's going on in the moment between you and the client. Then you can vary your behavior. You can look to see whether or not people hang in with you a little longer or whether they escape faster or seek to escape faster.
Mhm.
That gives you much more precision when you have that notion that escape is the termination of some aversive consequence that was occasioned by something that was going on right before that. this escape behavior will get reinforced by some reduction of something that's aversive in the environment, whether it's you having raised a tough issue, whether it's them having some private events that you don't have access to at the moment that's they want to avoid. But that level of technical stuff is much more powerful for you, the therapist, than just saying when the client doesn't do what they're supposed to do, that's avoidance behavior or escape
Mhm.
behavior.
Mhm.
Eh,
Yeah.
that's a testable notion, and it
Yeah.
ought to control your behavior as a therapist. And you ought to try different stuff based on your understanding of what could be the antecedent to that,
Yeah.
and then you measure whether or not it actually mattered. And that's kind of the process research that people are talking about, that Stefan Hoffman and Steve Hayes are writing about in their process-oriented CBT stuff, whether it's CBT or ACT or anything.
Mhm.
That's just a level of bringing attention to what's going on in the therapy room that's causing change. It's not some generic thing. There are processes that we know about at the bench science level that we ought to be able to detect and bring into the therapy room and test that stuff.
Mhm. Okay.
And that's the
I'm
precision that kind of knowing the basic science as opposed to the middle level terms, I think allows, that I think is really valuable.
Yeah. Yeah. I That's a very helpful, explicit way of coming circling back to that for me and I think for a lot of people.
And that that notion has been around and gets revitalized every few years by the treatment outcome research community, to say there's the Gordon Paul phrasing of what therapy works for whom, under what conditions, and so forth, back in the late 60s. Um, I've written about it, not with anywhere near the fame of Gordon Paul. Alan Kazan's written about it, and mechanisms, his emphasis on mechanisms of change. And then in the ACT community, certainly the stuff that Steve and Stefan
Mhm.
are writing now are just calls to get back to understanding what works. And all the things we do, some things work, some things don't. Some things we have a good explanation for, some places our explanations are inadequate. My interest is in that level of things. Someone
Mhm.
else can have a different interest, and I'm not one to say that's a stupid interest. I'm saying I have my interest
Yeah.
and you have
Yeah.
yours. They just take our attention in really different places, and I go to some talks and I don't go to others, and that's
Mhm.
legitimate. But
Okay.
that's where my head's at and has been for a long time.
And on that note, I'm just wondering on, this experiential or emotional avoidance that's inherent in a lot of the ACT work and I think, FAP too. Um, uh, if someone's talking to me about like some facet of them that they don't like, that they're used to, like when it comes up in their privately or publicly, they try to stay away from. Okay. And in session, I'm working to help them stay with that rather than, you know, move away. What's reinforcing about that? How do I make as a clinician, how do I make that reinforcing and make sure that what I'm doing is reinforcing?
Well, I think it's probably worthwhile to try. I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about that.
Okay.
Um, but I think the importance of the therapeutic relationship can't be overstated. And I think you're competing with a history of saying that these kinds of things I'm thinking about right now feel aversive.
Yeah.
And the question is, what kind of competing set of contingencies can you offer that are larger than the one with which they're familiar, but it's aversive to think about,
Yeah.
whether it was an abuse history or whatever else is
Hmm.
they're wanting to avoid, the concomitant kinds of feelings. It has to be the case, or it would be useful if it were the case, that talking with you and getting some notion that they're not a permanently scarred person, or that talking with you actually about this is better than avoiding talking to you about this stuff. And
Okay.
that's just like, I don't know how to do that, except that what I tell my students is you need to bring that part of you into the room that you reserve for people you really love and care
Mm.
about. And you show that kind of genuine, as
Yeah.
opposed to pretend, and
Mhm.
willingness to hear that and care about it.
Mhm.
I think empathy is a really strong thing to experience from other human beings who matter to you. And you know the kinds of um, biological preparedness that humans have make them, I think, prepared to be responsive to empathy and intimacy, closeness. They don't like things like loneliness and being feeling disenfranchised from other relationships, but they're used to that, and they have, when they get kind of these feelings that they want to avoid, it's because there's a long history of, if I let that go on, it's going to get even worse. And so you have to be a competing set of stimulus conditions that say, if I hang with this, I'm going to get something from Marcel that feels better than me just going away from this feeling at the moment.
Yeah.
It's a hard thing to produce, but it is what has to happen. People have to emit an alternative behavior that gets reinforced. This is the matching law 101
Yeah.
from learning theory, that people do what gets reinforced the most.
Mhm.
There, this I won't go into a long set of caveats about that, but that's the bottom line,
Mhm.
and it's a pretty powerful kind of statement. And one of the things I teach in my learning theory class, and then we talk about in supervision, is when clients aren't doing what you want them to be doing, it's because there's another behavior that's reinforced more heavily. Your job is to figure out how to make you and whatever you want to talk about in therapy more reinforcing than avoidance.
Yeah.
Not easy. But
Right.
an awareness that that's going on at the principal level, I think, gives you some idea of what you ought to be doing. And your repertoire from inviting that behavior is much different than how I would invite that behavior in all
Mhm.
likelihood, and certainly different from how a young female graduate student would, versus an old
Albert
fat
Ellis.
guy professor. Pardon me?
Albert Ellis.
Albert Ellis, yeah, the
Like we were
warm,
talking
the
earlier.
warm, loving character from from our nightmares. Yeah,
Yeah. And on I mean, on that note, part I mean, I find myself, I've tried on different masks of, caricatures of people I've learned from, and then over time have developed my own repertoire. I don't know if there's other, I'm sure that people naturally fall into their own style differently, but that was how I went about kind of being who I am in the therapy room.
I think that's incredibly important to do. I've Any of us who've done supervision experience young therapists saying, "What should I do?" And um, I'll, I can say, "Here's what I would do. Don't ever do that," because I have a long history of going through what you were talking about, Marcel, where you get comfortable with who you are, and you know what it is that you, when you're at your genuine best, bring into the room to people you care about, that matters to them. And um, Chuck Furster, not Chuck, he's not like my best friend, he's Charles Furster, wrote this nice paper in around 1967, give or take a year or two, on the difference between natural versus arbitrary reinforcement. And natural reinforcement is when you behave with a client in a way that, when those interactions are reinforcing are the same kinds of reinforcers that they'll experience in the real world, like genuine caring and so forth. If they emit those behaviors that matter to you, and you're not really odd, but you're a kind of a reasonable representation of what they'll run across in the real world, and you establish those behaviors on the part of the client, they should they should get reinforced in the real world because those contingencies naturally occur. If you say, the client says to you, you're a terrible therapist. I get really bored in here. I hate coming in here. And you say, thanks for sharing. That contingency doesn't exist in the real world. And they're expressing emotion. It isn't going to get reinforced in the real world. And if you reinforce not with great clarity what you're reinforcing
Yeah.
there,
But I'm a
it's,
nice guy, Bill. What else am I supposed to say? Come on.
yeah, there's that. So, and I think the classic example is if someone's about to go outside, a young person about going outside, and you say it's cold outside, put your coat on, and they put the coat on, and it's maintained by you saying put the coat on, and then you're reinforcing compliance for that.
Yeah.
That's an arbitrary reinforcement, and it's for your satisfaction as the person telling them to put the coat on. It's not for them.
Hmm.
Um, the natural reinforcer is they get outside and they stay warm, and that's the control you want to bring their behavior under, is the naturally occurring consequences
Ah,
that will work given their environment. And they're not all the same. I mean, preparing someone to go into an economically challenged environment is different than going into an affluent environment for the kinds of things they can emit that will be reinforced
hmm.
in meaningful ways.
Yeah.
It's not a simple world by any means. I don't mean to imply
Yeah.
that you can give an M&M, which would be an arbitrary reinforcer in most circumstances, and get easy behavior change.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the questions that all of this brings up for me is some of the mechanisms that I understand that are at play in so much of what we're talking about here is falls under this realm of exposure, right? Um, I'm wondering if I don't know if there's some dangers in approaching so much of what we do as just exposure work. Is it
Well, it's a heuristic, and like any heuristic, it's going to have functions and utilities, and it's going to have limitations. But if I could have invented and patented for royalties any concept in psychotherapy that I think is A, would pay off because people do it all the time, whether they recognize it or not, and B, that's got some basis in science, I would have picked exposure. I mean,
okay?
I think it actually is pretty foundational, because what we're talking about in exposure for many of the anxiety related kinds of problems that come along are you can just think of exposure as saying you got to be open to adding on to your history, because our behaviors is a function of our history, period.
Hmm.
And people can argue about whether should be a period or a comma there, but anyway, as a behaviorist, I think behavior is determined, and it's determined by a bunch of things, but of the one I have control over is history. I can say you are where you are now because of history, biology, yada yada.
Hmm.
The only thing I can change, I can't change your genetic makeup at this point, um, and I can't do anything except add on to your history. I can't change your history except I can change it by adding on to it. And I've never used this particular metaphor before because I'm not a big metaphor jock, but which I can't be an act therapist then. Um, but you can say, you imagine making a pot of stew, and if the first things you put in there are um, some water and some salt, you know, that doesn't taste very good, but that's the history of the pot right there. But I can keep adding into it. And as I add on to that, wherever it is now isn't where it's going to be down the road, as long as you can keep adding to it.
Hmm.
As soon as you say, I'm not going to add any more to it, that's where the soup is, and it's going to stay there. But it can go from really bad taste to really elegant ones as it evolves. And a new chef can come in and add to it and change it even more. So exposure is saying essentially people expose themselves to a set of circumstances and have a different set of contingencies operate. And Mauer's two-factor theory of acquisition and maintenance of phobias is all about that. If you don't get people to experience a situation to see that the um, unconditioned response doesn't occur, then they'll just go away. They'll never learn that that dog or that relationship isn't always going to lead to a bad consequence.
Hmm.
If they hang in there long enough to see that there are other consequences that happen, then the information value of seeing a dog or seeing a potential relationship changes. And I think that's a pretty robust process. There are things, if you look at respondent learning literature, that tell you some things you can predict and some things you should and shouldn't do to make the outcomes more or less likely that the behavior gets strengthened or not, whether it's an appetitive behavior or an avoidance behavior, either one.
Hmm.
There's science about all that stuff, and from a therapy point of view, it's getting people to move their behavior to see how the world actually works, as opposed to the last time they checked, they thought it worked.
Hmm. Yeah. Interacting with it.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. And do you have any go-tos for helping people, like, literature around thinking functionally and functional assessment that you send people to or assign?
Uh, yeah. I'm much better at assigning than referring to the. Let me think about that. I'll think about that and maybe give you some links to
Okay.
put into. And only in the following way. It's not that I don't have a whole list of them off
Yeah.
the top of my head, but I'm trying to think about the ones that would be packaged in a way that would be halfway fun for people
Eh,
to look at.
yeah, screw them. Doesn't have to be fun.
Okay. Well, Steve Hayes and I have written some things about
Yeah.
functional assessment.
Yeah.
Um, and, I think Haynes and O'Brien have written a whole bunch of stuff about it that's technical, but I think it gives you the nuts and bolts of how to think about it. With a lot of the functional assessment, functional analysis literature doesn't characterize the dynamic nature of what I think a functional case conceptualization does in therapy. Because if you think about what happens over therapy, and I don't do brief therapy,
Hmm.
um, just because I don't have control over enough variables to have a huge effect in a short amount of time for the most part.
Hmm.
Um, so as people develop new repertoires as therapy goes on, the things that were important in therapy up until that point were important, and we targeted those and so forth. And then as they develop new repertoires, they solve problems in their old version of their world, but now new opportunities open up.
Hmm.
And what was never on the table before now shows up as a liability or a strength that never showed up before. And so I have to change how I think what's going on in therapy functions now. And that process, I think, is really important, that you get a foundation to say, here's where I need to start. And you can't take forever to do that, but it can't be haphazard either.
Yeah.
Um, and because the client wants to make progress. But as that progress unfolds, new strengths and weaknesses, new liabilities and assets will emerge, as will new opportunities. And so you want to, I think you always have to say, are the things that I targeted in the beginning still the relevant things for people to move towards their valued goals? And the answer is often, I should have changed what I was doing 2 months ago, because we've either solved that problem or I haven't solved the problem and I should have if I had the right analysis.
Mm. Yeah, that is that's helpful to um to borrow as a lens.
Well, I think one of the great things for graduate students is to appreciate the luxury they have of having supervision. And for those practitioners who are in practice with either by themselves but have agreements with others, or their group practice meets at some regular point in time to say, how you doing on this case that you were stuck with before? And I think that kind of dialogue and support is just keeps us from behaving autistically
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
in ways that are really great. One of my I've had dogs for lots of life, and my favorite vet practice was in Seattle, where Tuesday mornings the practice was closed and they just had a journal club, and they had case reports of dogs, and they were willing to take the time out and then the loss of income to do that because it kept their practice better. And I'm sure it made it more interesting to talk to colleagues about something new.
Hmm.
And I think that's fabulous. I
Yeah.
love supervision
Yeah.
with my
Yeah.
students because it keeps me thinking and it keeps them thinking. And I can't imagine just doing, hours and hours and hours of private practice without
Yeah.
lifting my head up to say,
Yeah.
am I doing the the right thing given who I am and what I can do? And not
Mhm.
everybody can do everything, and that's hardly a liability. That's being in contact with reality.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a firm believer in what you're talking about. I have a group that I meet with, and we meet twice a month and do some real role plays, and we get people to give us consultation. It's fabulous. It's really fabulous. So, thanks so much, Bill, for chopping it up with me here today.
Oh, I really enjoyed it. I'd be happy to continue this conversation any
Yeah,
old time.
I would love for you to come back and continue to share the wisdom.
I'd be happy to. I enjoyed it a lot. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.
But I'm getting stronger. They take a piece of me. But I'm getting stronger. They take a piece of me. But I'm getting stronger. They take a piece of me.